Hey everyone, it's Jazz, and this is a dinner table conversation. I don't know why it was so hard for me to get that out, but yeah. So this is basically where I just kind of discuss. I don't know, whatever's on my brain, and I kind of sometimes usually have more questions than I do advice for any of that matter. It's not really much of a dinner table discussion because I ate my dinner. Now I'm basically eating ice cream. I'm eating Ben and Jerry's, the Gimme S'mores. I don't know what it is, but that ice cream is the best, and it tastes more like cookies and cream than it does s'mores. But anyway, I think the main thing that is I really want to talk about is basically wealth, because it's a topic that I kind of feel like is just reoccurring in my brain just because it just is. I am a business owner and I am very ambitious about it. But sometimes I feel guilty because I want that. Like, my goal is, and I don't really talk about this very openly because I know sometimes people are like, oh, well, that's a terrible goal. The thing for me is, like, I want to be a millionaire by the time I'm 50. And some people might think, like, wow, wealthy people are so selfish, or wealthy people, like, they all have this really negative connotation about wealthy people. And I have to always think of it in a spiritual context. That's just how I am, because if I don't, then it's just kind of, because money is just pieces of paper. But for me, it's more of means to an end, so that I can be able to afford to do certain things that I probably wouldn't have been able to do so. I probably wouldn't have been able to do so without it, because money, no matter what, money doesn't make you happy, but it does give you the ability to obtain resources, to do things that you may or may not have ever been able to do. And so I do a lot of solo Bible reading, because for the most part I read the Bible. Sometimes when I have questions, I go to my Bible, and then I'll have questions, and I usually just try to find the answers. Usually I'll use my Bible app on my phone to kind of give me verses, because you can search in the YouVersion app. You can actually search for a specific topic, and they'll give you a list of verses. So what I would do is I'd take those verses and I would just go back and read those entire chapters, and I would just be like, okay, so what is it? I need answers. And sometimes I usually have more questions than answers. So my question, I think this was back in December the 25th. Actually, this is Christmas of last year, 2022. And I had the question, it was finances, ? What does God say about money and wealth? And so I kind of, like I said, did that whole process, and I was trying to find answers. And basically, one of the verses that came up was Proverbs 13:4, which is the soul of the sluggard versus the soul of the diligent. So basically, from what I know, is that when you're obtaining wealth, is that, again, it's usually really boils down to hard work, because I feel like making money and doing these kinds of starting a business and things like that takes a lot of work. And I feel like sometimes people kind of take that as kind of like a that scares me sometimes. The AC comes on and it closes the door. It's really it's really frightening when you live alone. And so I get really distracted in thought. that kind of threw me off. But what I really was thinking about was how, when it talks about the soul of the sluggard versus the soul of the diligent, one hath nothing, one is made fat. So I kind of actually want to go back and I want to read that, because just for it to make sense for you in that context. And just, I've actually read the whole chapters on these, so it's not like I'm just kind of quoting just verses, but they're verses that kind of stood out. So 13, and I actually highlighted this, 13 verse 4, which is the soul of the sluggard desireth and hath nothing, but the soul of the diligent shall be made fat. And I don't know if you know this, but culturally, I remember one of my teachers in college, she was saying that she was from the Philippines, she was Filipino. So her family was from the Philippines, and she said anytime they see people who are bigger, they assume that they're wealthy, because sometimes in certain cultures or even in certain countries, being able to have food excessively is like a privilege. So it's funny, like when we come to America, and from a lot of different friends of mine from other countries, they've said that America, it just feels like you guys have so much food, and there's of course obesity is kind of like an issue, can be an issue, because I actually wrote a 10-page paper about it in like my first year in college. Don't ask why, even though I went to fashion school. But I really did some research into obesity as one of the top issues. But the thing is that when we think about diligence, is that, you know, like you might see a lot of like productivity YouTubers or influencers or people who are talking about like these daily habits. But the thing is that habits and being consistent is really what's going to make you fat, or in that case, it's like abundant. I think that's basically what it is. And Proverbs is actually the book of wisdom, for if you didn't know that. So a lot of things that you may read in Proverbs, it's very important to really look into. And so basically my note was that lazy people will never get what they desire, because they want what they want without effort. So, and I kind of see this sometimes when I talk to people about business, because I'll talk to anybody. Like, I mean, when I was in LA, I would talk to people on Lyft. You know, like I used to do Lyft carpool because I just wanted to talk to people and just kind of see what people are about. I'm gonna eat this before it melts. You know, so mainly, you know, I was always talking to people, and I remember when the topic of business comes up, I always met people who are like, oh, I'm really thinking about starting my own business and doing this, and it's like, I think people really are into the idea of business ownership because it's associated with wealth, and we have a lot of CEOs who have obtained massive amounts of wealth, and they do all these things. But again, it comes with work. So that, just like I said, I feel like I talk to so many people where it just feels like, I want to start a business, but they have no plan. Sometimes they don't even know specifically what they want to start a business around. So it's like really making sure you're thinking, I think it's mainly just making sure that you're really just kind of it's something that you're going to work at diligently. Like you know, when you create a plan and you actually work on it. It's one thing to talk about it, to write it down and things like that, but that's only part of it. That's the easiest part. And then also it goes into like, I think verse 7, where they talks about the deception of wealth, which is kind of a little bit what I was talking about. So like in verse 7, it was saying, in that same chapter, it was saying, there is that maketh himself rich, yet hath nothing. There is that maketh himself poor, yet hath great riches. I'm reading the King James Version, if you haven't noticed already, so there's all these weird things, but it's like, basically, like when you are rich, you really have nothing, because at the same time, I feel like it kind of reminds me of this, I think there's like a line in Macbeth from Shakespeare that says, I have everything, yet I have nothing. So he's obtained wealth, he obtained power, and yet he's still miserable. So, and then it even goes through like verses 10 through 12, where it says, only by pride cometh contention, but with the well advised is wisdom. Wealth gotten by vanity shall be diminished, but he that gathereth by labor shall increase. Hope deferreth maketh the heart sick, but when the desire cometh, it is a tree of life. So, I don't know, I feel like in a way, more or less, it's like when you know, getting it by vanity. I kind of wonder, like, in your opinion, what does it feel like vanity? So is it kind of like you're just doing so in vain or at other people's expense? Because I feel like vanity in itself, depending on the translation, can mean different things. Yeah, so I feel like that's, for the most part, like I was saying, with deception versus like hard labor and doing it, you know, I think more or less just doing it morally. And then I think from verse 17, where it talks about a wicked messenger falleth into mischief, but a faithful ambassador is health. So, faithful ambassador, wicked messenger. So, I don't know. I think that kind of is like where it kind of leads. So, because I feel like sometimes we think about wealth, it's like, well, I feel like it's just, there's always duality, you know. So when we think about wealthy people who are basically, they have everything, but they're using it in a way that doesn't glorify or doesn't really show who, because I feel like as a Christian, we are physical representations of who God is. So if we are a representation, then I feel like we should act like it. You know, it's like it's one of the things you take, or at least I take very seriously, especially when I first accepted Christ around the time of 16, is that over time, you know, I've stumbled and fallen, but more or less on the journey is that I know that sometimes, I don't know, the way that I know this is that the way that I think about it is, when I became a Christian, I realized I am actually a physical representation of God. So basically, like even going back to Adam and Eve, where it's like God was just like, you know, he's just this invisible thing, and was just like, all right, I'm going to create all these things. I'm going to create a physical representation of the spiritual world. And then when he created man, and it says in Genesis that man was created in God's image. So basically, we are in his image. So basically, physically speaking, we are in a way God, because we represent him. We were created as a physical representation of what he would have been like. So and that's why he has dominion over the spiritual world, and we as human beings have dominion over the physical world. So it's kind of like parallels, you know, spiritual and physical. So I take that very seriously. So when you think about it, more or less, it's like, you know, I'm a physical representation of God. So therefore, the way that I handle everything, like particularly finances and my financial goals, is a representation. So every time I leave that house, like the door over there, walk out the door, is that I'm a physical representation. So especially like when you think about wealth and power, especially like in a workplace setting or in a business setting, is that you know how you obtain your wealth is a representation of him. So like I said, I don't know what you don't have to listen to me. I just talk. I just talk. So when we think about opportunities, you know, like when I think about when people say that like, oh, like opportunities don't just fall in your lap, you have to go get them. Partially true. My thought process is, from my own life experience, is that, you know, opportunities can fall in your lap. Like they can come to you, but it's up to you to take it and run with it. You know, because I think about the fact that I do work a full-time job voluntarily. And a family friend, I had no idea. I was talking to her at a fundraiser, and she was running to be a circuit court judge in my state, for the state, but in my particular district. And I remember, like, she was a friend of my parents for a long time, and I remember, like, she sat down. She was on the campaign trail, sits down next to me and was like, "So tell me about yourself. What do you do?" and all these things. Because apparently, I found out she really loves young people, especially young people with ambition. And I was telling her about I'm multilingual, and I have a nonprofit for international and foreign language education, and that's something that I'm trying to, you know, promote. And I think that it's a crime for children to grow up with speaking only one language when we are a globally connected world. I'm digressing. I'm telling you this because I go on the deep end, you know. So I really care about these things. And so, and she was like, yeah, you know, well, you know, it was a really nice conversation. She's like a very like bubbly person. And then when the election came around, and I actually voted for her, then a week later she calls my mom, and my mom's like, hey, she wants, it's like, so she calls and is like, she wants to offer you a job in her office. I was like, what? I called the next day. That job basically gave me a huge pay increase. It increased my income. Because I was working a part-time job, and I came back from the pandemic, came back from LA, from the pandemic, and I literally felt like I was a failure because I lost my job, I couldn't pay my credit cards, and actually, like I think I might have talked about this before, I don't know, but I got sued by American Express because I wasn't paying. I had gone so long, and I was also working with a debt relief agency at the time. And then I was like, well, I'm paying my debt off. And then when this job came up, then I was able to pay it off faster. So opportunities come, you just have to take it and run with it, because opportunities will fall in your lap. And if you're like, nah, I don't want to do that, or you're just somewhere else mentally, then they're going to pass you by. So I think you just need to position yourself. Like, for example, I was at my mom's fundraiser, and I really kind of didn't want to be. I wanted to be there to support my mom, but I really just was there because it was like a pancake in a park event, and I just wanted to eat the pancakes. And I just was like, well, if I have to take donations at the table, then yeah, sure. So that thinking is that I positioned myself for an opportunity. Especially when you think about business and trying to make especially like at 20, people in your 20s where you're trying to basically establish yourself. I feel like you need to position yourself, be noticed, be seen, so that at least when opportunities come, you're there. So yeah. And then 18 says, it talks about poverty and shame. It says, poverty and shame shall be to him that refuseth instruction, but he that regardeth reproof shall be honored. So there was no footnote on this, which really kind of made me upset. But when you think about poverty and shame, it says poverty and shame shall be to him that refuseth instruction. Because here's the thing, I think, and it also talks about this somewhere else in Proverbs, where it says a wise man seeks wise counsel, and a fool basically doesn't. That thinks that their own opinion is right. So in that particular manner, is that like poverty, because I remember someone saying that poverty is not something that God rewards someone with, because some people might think that rich people are immoral and being poor is a way of being humble, and that's sure, if they believe that, go right ahead. But I feel like it's something that comes upon you when you don't follow instruction. That's why mentorship is important. If you don't have mentorship and you're not taking instruction from people who are more experienced, then I feel like you kind of just, I don't know, I feel like you just kind of again, poverty and shame. So I feel like, the idea of, and I don't mean to criticize at all, because I feel like I never want to criticize, because I feel like we're not meant to judge people, but I just have these thoughts in my head that where I'm like those stories where people are like, I quit my job to do this. Honestly, I feel like I would love to. There have been occasions where I would have loved to do that. I think I had a job one time in California. I hated it so bad. I hated it so much. I worked for a swimwear company in Anaheim. Hated that work environment. And I remember just waiting for them to fire me so I could collect unemployment. I was like, please, just let me leave, So like I said, I feel bad for that. I feel bad for thinking that, because, they extended this job to me, but I just really hated the environment, and I feel like maybe I should have been more honest with it. But, I think that when you leave your job and do other things, if you're not figuring out how you're going to support yourself, I'm more or less like a realist. So I feel like I'd rather take the job that I know for a fact I may be unhappy with until I can find something better. So that's just my thing. I never understood that, but it says following instructions, especially when we think about, because I feel like the way that we follow God is kind of not more or less. It's mainly with, with following God, He gives you abundance, exceedingly abundantly and above all we can ask for. So I feel like, if we're not following what God has said, that's poverty and shame, So that's just my thought process on that verse. And I think this is a really interesting chapter Proverbs 13 that we've been working through. But verse 20 through 21, where it talks about how association matters, So like, and I think in business that really applies more than anything, because who you associate with can elevate or lower you, like in your standards and things like that. So I think of the fact that like in 20 and 21 it says, he that walketh with wise men shall be wise, but a companion of fools shall be destroyed. Evil pursueth sinners, but to the righteous good shall be repaid. And then 22, I love this verse because I think about this a lot, where it says, Proverbs 13:22 says, a good man leaveth an inheritance to his children's children, and the wealth of the sinner is laid up for the just. So when I think about it, it's like, I always think about these things in the fact that, like, for example, like my grandmother passed away last year, November of 2022. And so just about everything, every major piece of furniture that's in this apartment it came from her house, because we have to clear it out and everything, but leave an inheritance for his children's children. So I feel like a lot of times, and my parents specifically have done this, where they've tried to invest a lot in my brother and I, and they're trying to make sure, because when you give, usually when you pass away, usually I think you're like, if you've lived a long life, you've accumulated a lot of wealth, you may have accumulated a lot of things, and it's just, most of the times it's usually going to your grandchildren anyway, because your parents are usually taking that inheritance. If they're the parents, then they will basically use that to help with their own, raising their own children. So like when I think about it, like I said, my wardrobe, my this dinner table that we're having this conversation on, a lot of things in my kitchen, my bed, my little footstool that's in front of the bed, most of that came from my grandmother. And so thinking about that, that's 2 generations. Even though the will actually said that everything goes to my mom and my aunt evenly, like her 2 daughters, but still, because of that, I mean, they're not going to just just a lot of stuff. So obviously, they're going to give it away to people who are going to want to use it. So for me, it's the case that I have a new apartment and I need stuff. So that kind of in passing that down. And I feel like a lot of times when I think about my own goals with wealth is that, I've had experience in my lifetime where, my family has struggled financially. And I feel like that's one of the reasons why I feel like if we're not trying to at least create some form of wealth or something to make it a little bit easier for the next generation, then I feel like, what are we doing? It's like if you're wealthy and you have kids and you have grandchildren and you just have all this stuff and you don't want to give it to anyone, it's, as it says here, is laid up for the just. So I just think that when an inheritance is something I am very fascinated with, especially when I think about particularly Black history, because we never really, like when I think about it, my great grandmother, who I managed to meet up until I was 13, I knew her up until I was 13, and she was born in, I think, 1917, and so that was a lot of history, especially when you think about segregation and you think about the fact that her relatives, this is my great grandmother is only. She's only 3 generations ahead of me. And then to think about, like, her great-grandmother was probably a slave. And so we didn't get to own anything. We were owned by people, by other, like our slave masters, but we never owned anything of our own. Even our own children could be sold into slavery. So when you think about it, it's really important to be able to have something to pass on to your children. And especially when you're watching them grow up. And I have no children, and I'm also single, so I can't really speak to that. My thing is that my plan is in the future, I do want to have children, and I do want to, I really do want to, pass things on. I want to actually have something that I can pass on to my own children and my own, I don't know. I feel like sometimes people might feel like it's kind of dumb, but my thing is that I feel like I want to leave like more of like a legacy where it's like, you have this portrait on the wall of me, and it's like, this is your great grandmother. She's the reason why our family has this, or we've been able to do this, and we started this, and we have this particular reputation in our family of why education is so important in our family because she did this. And it's not about bringing glory to me, more or less, but it's just that I want to be relevant in my own family. And I feel like when you have a purpose, you want to be relevant. Obviously, my focus is mainly on foreign language education, and I kind of want to use it as a way to kind of, again, help other people, especially since, like I said before, we live in a globalized world. But overall, I feel like those are kind of the main things. And my notes, particularly on that, was basically legacy and wealth and a good name. Because having a good name, like especially my last name, Cole, I take that very seriously, and I know that for a fact when I get married, I'm probably not going to change my name, because it's kind of like it goes together, Jazz Cole. And that last name has been associated with the fact that my dad's side of the family, they're mainly very well educated. They, like, I remember getting a notification from like this, like, we have this group email text chain with like a bunch of my other relatives, some I've never even met before, and they're like, oh, so Dr. such and such in our family is retiring, you know, and, you know, being well read, and the kind of conversations we would have, especially like even with my mom. So it's like basically creating a reputation. So like when I say my name, you know, it means something. So yeah. And I think it says also somewhere in Proverbs, I forget where it is, but it was talking about how a good name is worth more than rubies. It's worth more than anything. So I'm pretty much sure that my ice cream has melted, and it's basically soup. Still tastes good, but it's basically soup. But I basically just wanted to share some thoughts. And so my main question is, like, when in verse 25, I completely closed this, so I completely closed it, so now I have to go back and look at it. 25, it says, the righteous eateth to the satisfying of his soul, but the belly of the wicked shall want. And so it kind of makes me think, you know, like when people are just really like, I need more. But my question really is, when it says satisfied, what does that look like? You know, like, I mean, a lot of times, you know, wealth in itself, I feel like it's not going to be fulfilling. It's great because, you know, like it keeps you stable, you can buy things, you know, it keeps you completely, you know, where you particularly want to be in terms of not having to worry about where your food's going to come from or where you're going to live. But I feel like when we think about satisfied, like, what does that even look like? So that's the question I'm posing for you. And yeah, I really just want to know, like, what does it look like to be satisfied? So thanks for joining. We'll talk about something else next time in the next dinner table conversations. So yeah.